Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Alums for Campus Fairness webinar. My name is Joel Bond, and I am the Associate Director for Alums for Campus Fairness. And today we're hosting our Alumni Spotlight series, in which we highlight some of the great work that our alumni across the country are doing. And today we're welcoming Andrew Pessin, a graduate of Connecticut College, a professor, and he's here to talk about his newest book, We Are Never Green. He's a professor of philosophy as well at Connecticut College and campus bureau editor of the Algemeiner. In addition to his academic work, he has authored several philosophy books for the general reader and 3 novels, including most recently Nevergreen. And this is a satirical account of campus cancel culture and its ideological excesses and their impact on the Jews. His co-edited book, Anti-Zionism on Campus, the University, Free Speech, and BDS, was published in 2018 by Indiana University Press. For more information about him and his work, may be found at www.andrewpessin.com. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Andrew to give a little introduction of him. Andrew?
Thank you, Joel. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, folks, for spending a little bit of your weekday time with me. I'll talk for a little while, and then my understanding is we'll be able to open the floor for questions and conversation, etc. So let me give you first a little bit of my background and just clarify one thing. I'm not a graduate of Connecticut College. I'm not an alum there. I am a professor there. My undergraduate degree was from Yale, and my PhD is from Columbia. And I've been somewhat involved in the ACF chapter at Columbia in particular. For, as I'm sure many of the people participating in this call know, Columbia is a difficult place with respect to matters concerning Jews and respect to Israel. So there's a lot to keep an eye on there. So thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. I am a philosophy professor, as Joel said, and I've always been interested in matters Jewish and my Jewish identity, and I've always been interested in and a supporter of Israel. But for a good number of years, that was sort of, I wouldn't say a side interest, but it was not first and foremost in certainly my professional capacity. But that changed about 6 years or so ago. I had my own personal experience that really opened my eyes to the stark conclusion. We could talk about it more in the questions if you like, but it became clear to me almost overnight that the animus towards Israel that's infiltrating so many campuses just is a form of anti-Semitism. And lots of people like to debate the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but it became clear to me, kind of a revelation, that anti-Israel animus just is a form of anti-Semitism. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. And so for the past 6 years or so, my career has sort of taken a not predicted turn, an unexpected turn. I've been really very focused on matters Jewish and matters related to Israel. My research interests shifted. So instead of writing about Rene Descartes, the famous 17th century, I think, therefore I am philosopher, I've turned to Jewish matters, and Joel was mentioning a couple of my books, but in the last few years, I published this book, The Jewish God Question, taking a look at what Jewish thinkers have said about the book, the people, the land, the state. I published this book, Anti-Zionism on Campus, which is perhaps most directly related to the topics of ACF. This came out a couple of years ago, documenting the many ways anti-Zionism manifests itself on so many campuses today. I did this with Daron Benatar, Fordham University. Just this summer, came out with Poisoning the Wells, which is an anthology documenting the many manifestations and intense manifestations of anti-Semitism in the United States. And then, of course, the main topic tonight, which I'll talk about a little bit towards the end, is my newest novel called Nevergreen, which is about campus cancel culture and its impact on the Jews. For if lots of people are getting canceled these days, and I'll talk about that a bit. But what we know, those who follow these issues closely, the Jews are always the canary in the coal mine. It's my belief that the contemporary BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which has been targeting Israel since the early aughts, at least on campus in full form, is just cancel culture. BDS brought cancel culture to the campuses, and now we're sowing the fruits of that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But that's the main theme of the novel. So what is campus cancel culture? If you're on this call, you probably have some sense of that. What we're seeing is, instead of what was maybe, I don't know if I'd say the former model of what a university should be, but at least the ideal or aspiration of what a university should be. A university is a place that's about the pursuit, acquisition, generation of knowledge. And it was thought by many, by most of its stakeholders, that the best way to achieve that would be if the institution itself, the university itself, was a neutral environment, and it provided a forum and resources for people with a diversity of opinions. I'll stress that phrase again, a diversity of opinions, people who disagree, to come into this neutral space and basically duke it out intellectually by argument and by evidence and with reason, and overall with a tone of civility, something along those lines. And the thought would be that that's how knowledge advances, that ultimately the best arguments or the best evidence or the best reasoning wins out and convinces people. So that was the model of the university, and clearly essential for that to work is that phrase that I repeated, diversity of opinion. If everybody has the same opinion about whatever the issue might be, then you're done. Knowledge is finished. You're not going to advance anywhere. Nobody's going to disagree. You only move forward when some people not only disagree, but disagreement and diversity of opinion is encouraged. That's the way that knowledge moves forward. And that used to be, I think, the widely accepted ideal or aspiration of the university. Cancel culture comes to destroy all that. The idea of cancel culture these days is the exact opposite of what I just said. It's the idea that diversity of opinion is not a good thing, that the truth is largely held by the people who are at least the loudest in most universities. It's the idea that the university itself should adopt those truths and therefore stop being a neutral party. And it's the idea that if somebody disagrees, then A, they're disagreeing with the truth, so that's no good, right? And B, disagreement is ultimately understood to be harmful. And so somebody who disagrees must not merely be disagreed with, argued with, reasoned with in this neutral space, but instead that voice has to be silenced and preferably with that person eliminated from the campus space. So to be canceled in the campus environment, and we now talk about cancel culture in general outside the university, my focus will be within the university. To be canceled within the university is to, again, not merely be disagreed with, and not merely be disagreed with, maybe even vehemently and passionately. Maybe you think someone is really wrong, and maybe you think their opinions really are dangerous. You can make that case. That's not cancellation. Cancellation is when you start pushing for the silencing or elimination of that person. So whether it's calling for a professor to be suspended, or calling for an invited speaker to be disinvited, or even calling for somebody to be fired, once the response to a person goes from disagreement to some form of silencing punishment, we're talking cancellation. How does a typical case proceed? Well, if you follow the news, the university news at all, then you've certainly seen plenty of these. Maybe a professor says something in a class that goes against the orthodoxy, or maybe publishes an article in which he or she says something against the orthodoxy, or maybe a speaker has been invited to come who has said some unorthodox things, or maybe a student has ventured an opinion or two, either in a class or some other forum, that goes against the orthodoxy and gets the roost in a ruckus, to use an expression one of my characters in Evergreen uses. What typically happens? There's outrage. There's always some sort of online social media campaign. There's name calling. The person is a racist or a homophobe or a transphobe, or an Islamophobe. Sometimes there's a petition that goes around demanding the person be sanctioned in some way or another, silenced, removed from the classroom. There are dramatic claims. What some person, forget the name now, has coined the expression, a staged emergency. The fact that a professor may have said something in a classroom, there's an emergency and students are hurt or wounded and they feel unsafe by it. And of course, We know that violence is terrible. That can never be allowed, and incitement to violence can never be allowed. But if you insist that that person's opinion, that that person's words their speech is a form of violence, well, if they're harming people, we need to eliminate that person from the classroom or from the university space. So that's a typical way these things proceed. Each one has its own idiosyncratic bells and whistles, but you've no doubt heard of some cases, some very recent cases that were in the news. A University of Chicago geoscientist was scheduled to give a prestigious lecture at MIT, but because he had dared to criticize the reigning orthodoxy of diversity, equity, inclusion, and instead elsewhere, in a context utterly unrelated to the topic of his talk, he had argued for, I think it was fairness, equality, and merit. So because he supported fairness, equality, and merit in the university, there were calls to have him canceled. MIT capitulated. It was a really, I think, a shameful episode for MIT. This was just last month. And this prestigious lecture was canceled. There's the case of the Yale law student just in the past month or 6 weeks or so, who put out what you might think is a relatively innocent invitation to a Halloween party, but he used an expression that some people thought made some reference to something racist, even though that's not how he was using the expression. And he caused the ruckus to get into a roost, and the administration got involved, and they were pressuring him to apologize. They were threatening to ruin his career unless he apologized, etc. He actually fought back. Good for him. There was a case just in the past year, UCLA, a professor, some students had requested that basically students of color be given higher grades in the class or given things easier because it was so stressful to be a student of color. And he argued back that he thought that was actually illegal to do that, and he raised a bunch of practical objections to it. He got suspended, and I don't know if he's even back in the classroom yet. So those are just a few examples that you might have heard of over recent months. In terms of BDS and the Jews, which is, of course, the interest closest to my heart. Many examples just in recent days, in fact. So at Duke University, the wonderful grassroots pro-Israel student group, Students Supporting Israel, they were applying to be chartered as an official student group, and they were vetoed on totally bogus grounds, which is, of course, a direct way of silencing or canceling the pro-Israel voice on that campus. University of Toronto, Scarborough, if you followed this in the last couple of days, absolutely shocking. They passed a BDS resolution, which not only defunded pro-Israel groups, so now student groups can't form to advocate for Israel on this campus. That opinion is being silenced or eliminated, but it went so far as, in the name of what's called anti-normalization, they refuse to do anything that normalizes Israeli apartheid, to use their language. So that meant that even kosher food on campus has to be provided by a provider that does not in any way support Israeli apartheid. So they have to find an anti-Israel kosher catering company, which is another way of saying kosher food is not going to happen on that campus, and so forth. Williams College also had a similar thing, refusing to allow a pro-Israel group a couple of years ago. There have been several pro-Israel students on student governments who essentially have been subjected to campaigns to remove them from student government. Most recently, a young fellow named Max Price at Tufts University, a young woman named Rose Rich at USC last year, and so forth. So this cancellation thing, not enough. If you want to argue against Israel, by all means, that's part of the university mission, right? If you've got that opinion, bring it into the neutral space, make your case. That's what you're invited to do. But that's not the form that it's taking on many campuses. The form it's taking is don't allow pro-Israel student groups to form. Don't allow pro-Israel students to serve on student governments. Don't allow kosher food. It's not very far from the place where you're not going to allow Jews. Now, that might sound like an exaggeration, but maybe I'm a little pessimistic, but it is quite clear to me that what's being targeted ultimately on these campuses, by the way, Israel doesn't suffer the slightest when University of Toronto has a BDS resolution. The people who suffer and the people who are being targeted are primarily the Jewish students on campus. They are being silenced, their political opinions are being suppressed, and they're being told they are not welcome on many, many campuses. So that's campus cancel culture and how it impacts the Jews. I would argue what we're seeing in the it's exploded in the last few years. There's just so many cases. FIRE, a wonderful organization, I think it's Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. They're a campus free speech organization. I recommend people follow them. They have documented 426 incidents targeting scholars at public and private American institutions of higher education, and 477 disinvitations, I think in roughly the last 5 years or so, just to give you a sense of the scope of that. So it's happening all over the place. The situation is so dire now that a recent survey that FIRE did of 20,000 students at 55 colleges, so this is a big survey, found that 60% of students say they were afraid to express their opinions out of fear of retaliation. So it seems to me, when that's the case, the university is dead, right? Or if the university has, the mission of the university is the acquisition and generation of knowledge, if people are afraid to express their opinions, 60% of students afraid to express their opinions. I'm sure that number, I know that number goes higher if you ask Jewish students to express their opinions about Israel, right? Surveys are showing that Jewish students are experiencing tremendous anti-Semitism on campus, hiding their identities, not speaking up. Well, when students are not speaking up, the university, the mission of the university has simply failed. So I think the situation is dire. As I mentioned, it's exploded in the last 5 years, but I would trace it back to the beginning of the BDS movement. There've always been individual episodes going back decades, but in terms of a large-scale phenomenon, when BDS really started to hit campuses in the early aughts, BDS is a campaign to cancel the unpopular opinion that Israel has a right to exist, and more importantly, that Jewish students have the right to advocate for Israel on a campus. So it's a cancellation campaign, and I think it sort of watered the ground, and now in recent years, it has exploded. I would argue, just to spend a couple of minutes on this, we can talk more about it in the questions if you're interested, section if you're interested, but no doubt, I think the accelerant, if BDS sort of water the ground, I'm going to mix metaphors here, BDS set the table, no, water the ground. The thing that lit the match or has accelerated is critical race theory, I would argue. CRT, people on this call are probably familiar with it. It has some very technical definitions or understandings, but whatever's going on the level of scholarship, by the time the ideas trickle down and are actually manifest on campuses by many people, CRT just becomes sort of a general expression for a whole package of ideas that may well be divorced from whatever scholarship spawned them in the first place. So some of those ideas, you may well be familiar with them. The idea of systemic racism, that racism is not merely the result of individual racist actions or beliefs. There's certainly some of that, but that racism is somehow built into the systems or structures. So even if there's no individual people acting in racist ways or with racist beliefs, the system itself generates racist outcomes. And the idea there is that it's embedded in the legal system and in the economy, the free enterprise system, it's racist in the sense that it ultimately promotes the privileges and benefits of white people at the expense of persons of color. And so part of CRT is also the idea that race infiltrates all areas of inquiry and all areas of behavior. And that in the United States or in the West in general, but certainly in the United States where this is a burning fire right now, the dominant culture is to perpetuate white supremacy. And that certain concepts and norms go along with that minority groups or persons of color are subjected to. And you even see some very extreme things like that concepts such as being on time or hard work, or even with that geoscientist case at MIT, one of the women who supported canceling that guy argued that something like intellectual rigor is really like a white person's concept. So you see what I think are really crazy ideas like that being on time, hard work, punctuality, responsibility, intellectual rigor are white ideas that are meant ultimately to oppress non-white persons. You get the idea in CRT. I'll just mention one or two more of its components. that there's this thing called white privileged, that in fact, much of what a white person gets in his life is may or may not be earned, but is a benefit of simply being white, where the system being rigged to prevent non-white persons from succeeding. As a result of that, you need to change, according to this doctrine, you need to change the criteria used to measure merit and success, because those are designed to perpetuate white supremacy. And that's what generates movements such as getting rid of standardized tests in a lot of schools. A number of universities are no longer requiring, like the SAT for admission, because the idea is these tests are biased to perpetuate white supremacy. And finally, you get the idea that equity replaces equality. So equality has typically meant something like the idea that all individuals should be treated equally, regardless of their race or their gender or their sexual preference or many other things. Equity is the idea that all outcomes should be roughly equal. And so if there's any disparity of outcomes, so if white people have a higher mean or median income than people of color, the idea is that is an indication of racism. It must be racism, that only racism built into the system explains the inequity of outcome. And so those are some of the ideas of CRT. We can talk more about them in the question period. It's more than just about race, although it goes by that general phrase, critical race theory. It's really the idea that there's all forms of oppression and that people break into two categories, oppressor and oppressed, and white and non-white are the starting points, but really it also applies to race and gender and sexual preference and disability and Muslims as well. The idea being that essentially white heterosexual Christian men oppress everybody is what it boils down to. Oversimplified, but that's the form it typically takes on campus. It's incredibly oversimplified. If that's CRT, and that's what's really lighting campuses on fire these days, not just campuses, it's moving into K through 12. California just passed an ethnic studies requirement, which is really bringing CRT into the primary schools. There's a movement to bring it into Massachusetts next. It's going to spread through the country, K through 12 as well. This movement, let me add one more point to it. One more characteristic, which is this concept of intersectionality as well, which is a very, very important concept. I have no doubt myself that intersectionality has important kernels of truth in it in its initial forms, but by the time it sprinkles down and is manifested in many people's speeches and behaviors, it becomes something very problematic. Intersectionality is roughly the idea that all forms of oppression are interconnected with each other. And what that means in practice is you can't really fight racism unless you're also fighting against sexism and fighting against homophobia and fighting against Islamophobia, etc. All the forms of oppression are connected. You can't fight one unless you fight all of them. And that's what really gets you to that incredibly oversimplified conclusion that essentially there's all these classes of people who are oppressed, people, non-white people, women, non-heterosexual people, disabled people, Muslims, overweight people, etc. And because they're all connected, there's a single class of persons who's oppressing all of them, and that ends up being typically the white, the heterosexual Christian male, abled, not disabled Christian male, etc. Right? So you get this picture of everybody's either, well, not everybody. So there's the oppressor and the oppressed, and there's a large bulk of people in the oppressed category, and then this category of persons who are the oppressor. Well, if all that is CRT as it's typically manifest on many, many campuses, this is very, very bad for the Jews. This is horrific for the Jews. It immediately connects in the minds of the proponents, first of all, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which my own preferred name for that conflict is the Israeli-Palestinian Jewish-Arab-Muslim conflict, which only begins to scratch the surface of how complex that conflict is once you actually study it. Nevertheless, we'll go with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's easier to say. And as these proponents of this theory start looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what is it they see? Of course, they see white Jews oppressing Palestinian persons of color. That's what they see. They see it through the lens that they're applying to America right now. They see it as a racial conflict. And of course, it's the whites against the non-whites in this particular case. And the Jew ends up representing, in the minds of many of these CRT thinkers, or proponents better, ends up representing almost, and this is so painfully, ironically horrible, the Jew represents the whitest of the white in the minds of many of the proponents here. Jews, of course, have benefited from white privilege because in America, they think most Jews pass for white, most Jews are white. And when you get this idea of privilege, this hashtag Jewish privilege flies around the internet at regular intervals, pops up on campuses at various times. So Jews have privileged. And when you use that word privilege, that indicates whatever Jews have managed to accomplish for themselves in their 120 years of the golden Medina of the United States since they immigrated in large numbers at the beginning of the 20th century. Jews, of course, have overall collectively done quite well for themselves. They've managed to, they're highly educated. Their median income is higher than many other groups. By the way, apparently Indian Americans have, if I have this fact right, have like the highest median average. And apparently Nigerian Americans have an incredibly high median income or something like that, which of course goes against the typical narrative because Nigerian and Indian Americans are not white persons, and yet they actually, and Asian Americans also do above the average, right? So this whole narrative has a lot of problems. But in any case, Jews do better than average. And if you're in the mindset that there's a system in place that privileges some and oppresses others, well, if Jews are doing better, it's because clearly the system is rigged. And who's rigging it? The Jews. The Jews rig the system so that they do well and other people don't do well. And what you get, and I'm simplifying here, but I do want to wrap up in just a few minutes. What you get is basically the following idea. When you add CRT and intersectionality and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict all together, you get the idea that on many campuses, to be a Jew is to be a white supremacist responsible for ethnic cleansing, genocide, and apartheid abroad, and racial oppression at home, and homophobia and transphobia and Islamophobia, et cetera, right? So to be a Jew on campus is to be the epitome of the oppressor. And just as Jews are oppressing the Palestinians, they're also ultimately responsible for all the racist oppression going on in the United States. It's a crazy conspiracy theory is what it comes down to in the end. And it's generated directly by CRT plus intersectionality plus their take on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is not a surprise that Jewish students are being excluded from many, explicitly excluded from many progressive movements, both on and off campus. Black Lives Matter has a vicious anti-Israel plank. Black Lives Matter on many campuses. Jews have to essentially declare that they hate Israel before they'll be allowed to participate in fighting racism in the United States. Feminist groups have excluded Jews. The Dyke March a couple of times over the last couple of years. Most recently, there was a thing over the summer in DC there was a climate change thing, and a group withdrew because there were some Jewish groups part of it. So precisely because Jews are now seen as part of the oppressor network, the white supremacists, the painful irony is, of course, is that Jews have been massacred by and are targeted by actual white supremacists, but nevertheless, this campus demographic sees the Jews as the white supremacists oppressing basically everybody else. As I said, it's a conspiracy theory. That's what it comes down to in the end. It's a conspiracy theory that's really no different from protocols for the elders of Zion, where Jews control the world to benefit themselves and keep everybody else down. The idea that a conspiracy theory like this has taken hold on American universities is terrifying. The university is the last place you should find a conspiracy theory. And yet that's what this is. And the mark of a conspiracy theory ultimately is that it is just grossly divorced from reality. Grossly divorced. It is deranged. It is literally crazy. And I submit that that is the current state of affairs on all too many campuses. It's crazy. And so with that in mind, what can you do? There's lots of things different people do. There's some intellectuals who are doing the really heavy lifting and arguing back against critical race theory and pointing out what a flawed narrative it produces. And that's important work as well. There's certainly lots of wonderful people advocating for Israel on campuses. Israel, again, now is seen as the epitome of white oppressive evil on campuses. It's persona non grata on many campuses, including Duke University and University of Toronto, just to give recent examples. So there are people that are battling those battles, groups like Students Supporting Israel, wonderful group, Alums for Campus Fairness, trying to energize alums to weigh in and use their influence on their campuses. I thought I would do something a little bit, I've done some of that, but I thought I would do something a little bit different and a little bit more fun. So that's why I wrote the novel, Never Green. And I just want to spend a couple minutes telling you about the novel, and then maybe we'll open the floor for some questions. Full information, if you're interested, and lots of endorsements are on my website, which is andrewpessin.com. So check out the details there. In any case, Never Green. It's the basic story is a midlife physician by a chance opportunity gets the chance of a lifetime. He's invited to come give a talk at interesting liberal arts, small private liberal arts college. He's always sort of wanted to go into academia. He thought that might have been a better life than the life he chose as a physician. So this is really a wonderful opportunity for him. He goes to this campus. The campus is, of course, it's Never Green College. And yes, it is deliberately hinting at Evergreen State College, which is a very, very woke, left progressive place that was much in the news a couple of years ago with the Brett Weinstein affair, if you're familiar with that particular one. But the book is not about Evergreen State College, but the title is a nod to it. So he goes to this Never Green College. As it turns out, nobody turns up for his talk, but since this was the opportunity of a lifetime to speak on a college campus, he goes ahead and gives his talk anyway to the empty room, because why not? Why waste that opportunity? And then by a series of twists and turns, he or his talk becomes the center of a firestorm of controversy on that campus, a cancellation campaign that may or may not have fatal consequences. I don't want to give away any spoilers. And what I'm trying to do in this book, first of all, I hope it's fun. If it's not fun and entertaining, then it won't have any influence. Nobody was going to read it. So I hope it's fun and entertaining first and foremost. What I'm trying to do is at least two different things. One is get across what it feels like subjectively to be the target of a cancellation campaign. If you only read about this in the news outside, you read, it's like there's a tempest in a teacup. There's some people protesting. There's a petition going around condemning somebody, whatever. But what is not fully appreciated is that when you are being targeted for cancellation, it hurts. It is being socially ostracized. It is being name called. It is being bullied. It almost, in the bigger cases, it always comes with death threats because there's no shortage of crazies out there. And so once you've been labeled as a racist or a genocidal, ethnic cleansing racist, you're going to get death threats from all sorts of people. And the scary thing in the world we live in is any one of those could be credible. You don't know. It's absolutely terrifying. You feel like you are running for your life. The mob is coming after you with the pitchforks and the pitchforks and the flame, what are they called? Then the flames, they're coming after you. It's terrible. So I wanted to get that across, what it feels like, so people can appreciate it, really how serious these things are. And then B, I wanted to get across just how utterly, ultimately deranged cancel culture is. It's literally crazy. It is divorced from reality. And it is conspiratorial, as I mentioned a moment ago. It is irrational. And so it's not by any accident that Never Green College, the location for the story, is built on, it was previously the location of an insane asylum. It's actually on an island. It has a little bit of a horror feel to it. Don't worry, it's not scary, but it has a little bit of a horror feel. It's on this island. There's no way off the island. There's only a ferry that comes twice a day. And it was previously the grounds of an insane asylum. And that's because it pains me to say this, But in my heart, I think universities are turning into insane asylums with this commitment to this ideology that is taken to such an extreme that it is no longer tolerable to hear somebody who disagrees with you. And instead, you have to drive that person out. And so that's the goal of Nevergreen, to get across at least those two things. Along the way, it's a satire, so it's poking fun at a lot of the, the particular craziness which composes a lot of campuses these days. But the larger message is, again, to get across what it feels like to be the target of a cancel campaign. So you appreciate how against the norms of the university this is, and to get across really ultimately how crazy and deranged these are. So I hope you'll check out the book. Again, andrewpessin.com is my website. It has lots more information and lots of endorsements. And that's it. So I think I'm ready to entertain questions or comments, if there are any.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andrew, for diving into your new book. And we're excited to welcome any questions that anybody has. It looks like we have a question, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. Where have the community leaders who are major donors at universities, where have they been in this fight against campus anti-Semitism?
That's a fine question. And, I know right now there's a movement afoot to really challenge Jewish leadership on a lot of fronts right now. Certainly there's activity. There's groups, Stand With Us and Alums for Campus Fairness are doing plenty. They are supporting students. They are providing materials to students, running programs, all that sort of stuff, which is absolutely essential. Part of the problem is, Jews have always been very good donors for a very small demographic group. Jews are like less than 2% of the American population or something like that. You certainly will find plenty of Jewish names on buildings on lots of major universities. So Jews have always been active donors. Jews have always believed in education, for amongst other reasons, right? What we have not seen, as far as I know, certainly on any significant scale, are the major donors making a loud noise and making a stink on these subjects when one presumes they're aware of what's going on campuses. One presumes they're aware of the anti-Israel hostility. And again, I stress, I believe, okay, criticize Israel. If you want to have all sorts of lectures about, all the things you think Israel does wrong, that's fine. But what we're seeing on campuses is not that. We're seeing this crazed hostility where there are calls for the destruction of the state of Israel as opposed to criticizing some one or more policies. That is the norm, where calls for anti-normalization, where student groups will not work with or speak to any groups that support Israel, and they will try to cancel and disrupt talks about Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not criticism. That would be fine. It is cancellation and it is elimination. And I'm just not aware of any major donors, the ones that give buildings, saying enough is enough, I'm withholding my donation. My own belief is that universities, the money talks in a very big way. And, part of the problem is the Jews, we have other allies. There's certainly many Christian Zionists, for example, but the Jews are too small a group for our money to make too much of a difference, I'm thinking, on a lot of the major universities. And what I know is lots of individuals. I've seen people, right, alums, and maybe alums for Campus Fairness maybe sometimes organizes this, I don't know, but I've seen alums writing letters saying, that's it, I'm not giving any more money to you because of your refusal to step up to this. So on an individual level, we're seeing it, but the big donors, I'm not aware of any of them like literally coming to university saying, yeah, that's it, you just lost my $5 million donation next year unless you make changes X, Y, and Z. So they don't seem to be there. So that's at least part of the question. Let's maybe move on to another question. I see there's a few in the chat.
Yes, I think the next question is from Sandy Wasserman. She's asked, have you been invited to speak at any campuses about this book as a means of addressing the cancel culture issue? And also, did the tone of cancel culture on campus change after the Israeli election and new government?
I have not been invited to any campuses to talk about this book. So yeah, if you know of anyone who wants to invite me, let me know. I'm happy to do that. I'm actually personally a non-confrontational sort of person, so I don't necessarily relish walking into a lion's den, but I'm game if they invite me. As far as the tone, I don't think there's been any change in tone whatsoever. The hostility, it turns out it wasn't all about Netanyahu, like, because there were some who were saying, well, of course Israel is the target of so much ire because Netanyahu is a right-wing fanaticist or something like that. Yeah, but that's not the case. There's a new regime in power, and the hostility continues without a blip. So it turns out it's not about the particular government of Israel that gets them upset. It's not about any particular policies either, although they'll always target policies. It's the very existence of Israel that is unacceptable to the campus crowd.
Great answer. Looking at another question, what is your advice for students who experience anti-Semitism on campus, and specifically cancel culture? Students like Max Price and students like Rose Rich.
Yeah. Well, we have some great heroes amongst our young people, and both those names, Max Price and Rose Rich and others. The first thing I would say is if you are individually the target of a cancel campaign, it is very isolating. You feel very alone because these campaigns are so overwhelming. It's like a mob scene. There are maybe many people who are on your side. They actually think you're right, or certainly they disagree with the way you're being treated, but it's the bystander effect, right? It's very scary to speak up on behalf of someone being targeted because then the mob's going to come after you. And so it is not uncommon that when you're being canceled, that you have very few public allies. Maybe you have a few private allies, people who say they're with you, but there's very few people typically who are willing to stand up. What you need to do, if I'm to give advice, is you need to find those allies. And typically now those allies are off-campus groups. So again, stand with us. The Brandeis Center, which look for legal support, as I was saying earlier. So the only thing that moves universities, I said, money talks. And the other thing that can move a university is the threat of litigation, especially litigation that can come with a lot of PR. And so Stand With Us has a legal department, and the Brandeis Center is wonderful, and Lawfare also has resources. So you want to consult early and often with legal resources, because once you have a legal team on your side, everything changes. You have power when you have a legal team. You may not be able to silence the mob, but now the university is going to feel the obligation to silence the mob. And so I think that's what I would advise a student: reach out to any one of these major organizations, reach out for legal assistance, which all of them will offer or connect you to as well, and get some big guns on your side, because to be alone, it takes unbelievable strength of character to sort of withstand that. But when you've got strong allies, then you have the ability to fight back. And my hope is that people do fight back. The last thing you ever want to do is apologize and give in if you think you've done nothing wrong. I mean, obviously, if in life you've made a mistake and it's pointed out to you, you might apologize. But in most of these cases, the thing you've done wrong is stand up for Israel, and that is not something you ever need to apologize for. So don't.
And now we have another question from one of our alumni leaders, Melinda Maiden. She's asking, can some cancellations gradually drift off in a sense? That is, after the initial emotion, is there a loss of interest and or intensity?
So can you just give me the first part of that again? Do they drift off after a while?
Yeah, the cancellation movement is what she's asking. Does the fervor from it fade away?
That's a good question. Obviously, each campaign is different. My sense is groups will try to go for, in the same way that, lions will go for the weakest member of the herd, right? Like the sick one or the young one, etc. They go for the people they think are most likely to fold. You have examples of scholars, for example, who have been roughly getting the roost in a ruckus consistently for many years and never folded. And the cancel people, they give up after a little while because they realize they're not going to get what they want off of that person. But if they think they can get you to capitulate, if they think they can get you fired, they'll keep going until they do that. So no doubt some peter off quickly. I'm sure they do, but others can literally last months and months and months until they get the result that they want. So back to the advice question. The advice question is do not run, do not hide, stand up and do not apologize, right? And if they realize they're not going to get you, I think they are more likely to go away more quickly and move on to some other target.
Thank you. That was a very good answer. We have another question from Kelly Rogers. She's asking
Kelly.
something specific. Doesn't speaking out become more of a form of career suicide in this climate? What do you tell your frightened students to do, and even frightened colleagues?
Thank you, Kelly, for joining. That's a great question. It is a form of career suicide. So most people are quiet. I can name a half dozen tenured professors who are pro-Israel who will never say a word about Israel publicly because of this, right? And as I mentioned, the survey from FIRE, which said that 60% of students, was it 60% of students are afraid to express their opinions. So it's the same thing. You would hope, once you're tenured gives you some sort of protection. It's really pretty hard to fire a tenured professor. However, not impossible. I'll give you the case of Professor Charles Nagy at University of Central Florida last year, who challenged some of the orthodoxy about critical race theory. And what the university did, it was stunning. And my hope is that legal action will be involved, and it will be furious and strong. What the university did was they put out a general call to all. This is a person who'd been teaching there for many, many years, had, I believe, won teaching awards, had fantastic teaching evaluations. Everything was great, right? But they put out a call for students who'd ever taken any of his classes at any point over the years. Do you have any complaints about this person? And you could submit them anonymously. Can you imagine? So in other words, they had nothing on record that could possibly get him. And his remarks about the orthodoxy were absolutely protected by academic freedom and free speech. But they created an investigation which was, biased from the beginning, because anyone could say anything without any evidence and not even put their name on it. And it resulted in his being fired. This was a tenured professor. And what's entirely clear was he was being fired because he said a few things that these people found offensive, and they trumped up charges to justify that firing. My hope is there will be retribution and legal action there. So yes, it is terrifying. That's why maybe some tenured professors don't speak up either. It is career suicide. What we're all familiar with, what gets the news, of course, are the BDS campaigns, the explicit campaigns, such as the one at University of Toronto Scarborough the last couple of days. But what doesn't make the news, but which is really as devastating, is what Carrie Nelson, who's a wonderful figure on these issues, really a real hero as well, has called like the silent boycott, where it's, if you're known to be pro-Israel, you know what, your paper is going to be rejected from a journal. They'll find a reason, just like they found a reason to fire Professor Nagy. So too, they'll find a reason to reject your papers. Israeli scholars tend to hide their affiliations when they submit papers now, because they tend to get rejected. You don't get invited to conferences. As Sandy Wasserman asked, have I been invited to any campuses to talk about this book? No, not yet. But it wouldn't surprise me that pro-Israel people are not going to be invited to a lot of campuses. So it doesn't necessarily come in the form of a big, splashy, newsworthy BDS campaign. It is sort of the silent boycott. It is the career suicide, suicide by 1,000 cuts, career suicide by 1,000 cuts, that is generated by speaking up. So yeah, Kelly, I think a lot of people are afraid of career suicide. And this is obviously a terrible climate for the Jews and for someone who supports Israel's right to exist and maybe defend herself. But more generally, it is the end of the university, because people, not just on the topic of Israel and Jews now, but people are afraid to say anything. And what's a university for if nobody's going to speak up?
I have a question from Philip Miller that I think is a very interesting question, and it basically asks, who is leading these movements to cancel Jewish and Zionist students on campus? And to merge it with another question, do these leaders of these movements, do they often come outside of campus from non-students?
So come from off campus. So who on campus, by far, the primary organization is a group called Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP. This has it's an international organization. They claim to have 200 something chapters on different universities, I think, in North America. Sometimes they go by different names on the campuses, but SJP is the most common name. And they are invariably at the forefront of these movements. But you might remember I mentioned that concept of intersectionality a while back, the idea that all forms of oppression are connected. What SJP has done expertly, and you have to give them credit for their political machinations here, is they build coalitions with all the oppressed groups on campus. And so, for example, whenever there's a BDS resolution being introduced into a student government, you will see the sponsoring organizations, SJP will be right at the top. And then you'll also see whatever the queer groups, the feminist groups, the Latino groups, all the indigenous peoples groups, all the left-wing progressive movements on campus. Every single one of them will sign on to that BDS resolution because, after all, in their ideology, Jews are the white oppressors of all people. And so all these oppressed people are going to band together in order to beat back the Jews. And so SJP leads it, but they successfully build these very broad coalitions. Those coalitions, of course, will also include typically the key Jewish group, Jewish Voice for Peace, which I would argue is neither Jewish nor for peace, but they are at least ostensibly, officially Jews who also are openly, explicitly anti-Zionist and call for the destruction of Israel. So they are as hostile towards Israel as Students for Justice in Palestine is, and they will typically join in with this coalition. Do they come from off campus? There isn't a lot of clear information on ultimately who funds SJP. There is a national organization. There's another group called American Muslims for Palestine, which I understand has given financial support to SJP. There's no question there is external funding and external organization, because what you see, for example, is BDS resolutions. There's a template which is just copied at lots of different universities, maybe with minor variations. So somebody is organizing the large campaign. It's not just one campaign here, one campaign there. There's clearly a mastermind behind the whole thing. And you also see, for example, many universities have what they call Israeli Apartheid Week, which is just a full week of demonizing and slandering Israel on a campus. It usually involves building a big wall on the central quad of the campus, and on the wall is all this information, mostly lies or misrepresentations about Israel's violations of human rights, et cetera, et cetera. They take over the campus quad for a week. These are often fancy, slick, well-produced things, and they seem to travel from campus to campus to campus. So pretty clearly, there's a central brain that's coordinating a lot of this and funding a lot of it, but it's not really well known where that funding comes from. Most student organizations officially claim their funding only comes from their local student government, but that doesn't explain their ability to build apartheid walls, as they call it, or often bring in very expensive, anti-Israel speakers to these campuses. So there's clearly some other source of funding, but as I said, not well known where that traces to.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been wonderful having you. I have one question to end it off with, and then you can kind of plug your website and anything else you have going on in the next couple of months.
Okay.
What is your advice for alumni who want to help fight anti-Semitism at their alma maters?
Yeah, that's great. And, alumni, I still think of as the undertapped resource here, because many alumni, there's partly the age difference thing. Today's youth are really very fervent about this ideology, but most of the generation ahead of them doesn't quite share that same feeling. And alumni, of course, are a major source of dollars for the universities, et cetera. So the question was, what should alumni do? Is that right? So first and foremost, you have to be informed. You have to know what's going on the campuses, on the campus, your alma mater, obviously, but campuses more generally. I should have mentioned, I'm also campus bureau editor for the Algemeiner, which is a wonderful news outlet that focuses on Jews and Israel related issues. And as campus bureau editor, we have a bureau where we focus on what's going on campus. So if you follow the Algemeiner, Algemeiner.com, you can sign up for the daily newsletter. That's just a great way to stay informed about what's going on campuses. And then when something's going on, as it invariably will, it will come to your campus soon. If it hasn't already, then you need to speak up. You need to write letters. I encourage everybody, if there's a cancellation campaign going on, like someone's being targeted or Jewish students are being targeted, reach out to those students, send them a supportive note, offer them whatever support you can, because as I mentioned, when you're being targeted, it's very isolating. It's terrifying to get outside notes, outside words of support. I make it a habit. Anytime I write an email, and 9 times out of 10, I get an email back saying, thank you so much for reaching out. I really appreciate your support, et cetera, et cetera. So I strongly recommend getting on the Algemeiner list, staying informed. When something happens, reach out to the students involved to support them, if it's a cancellation campaign. And then, of course, write to the administration and use your dollars. If you give any dollars, tell them you're not going to give any dollars if you're not happy about the way they are handling whatever the episode is. And of course, obviously, be involved with Alums for Campus Fairness as well. So those are a few thoughts about alums.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. As always, it's wonderful having you. We're excited for everything that you're going to do moving forward. We can't wait for your next novel. And well, I'm expecting you'll probably have
you're going to have to wait
in the future.
That one's a little ways off. But anyway, do check this out. Wonderful Hanukkah gift. Amazon will still get it to you in time for the Hanukkah. Certainly a holiday gift. AndrewPessin.com for full information, but please do check it out.
Amazing. And if anyone didn't get to ask their questions, you can feel free to email me at joelb@campusfairness.org, and Great. I will forward your question over to Andrew.
That sounds good.
So without further ado, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody, for participating, and thanks, Joel, for having me. Have a good night.